Imagine waking up, taking a DNA test, and finding out that your ancestry isn't what you thought it was. Maybe you're connected to people you never expected. Ancient Amazonian warriors, Iberian settlers, or African royalty. The Caribbean, a region known for its rich culture and breathtaking landscapes, holds a far more complex genetic history than most realize. Behind every modern Caribbean person is a story written in their DNA, a story shaped by migration, conquest, and survival. But what if the history books only told part of the story? What if everything you thought you knew about Caribbean ancestry was missing a crucial piece? The Caribbean is often seen as a melting pot, a place where cultures collided, but beneath the surface lies an intricate genetic puzzle. Scientists have spent years trying to decode the origins of the region's people, and what they've found is nothing short of astonishing. The first settlers of the Caribbean didn't come from North America, as once believed. Instead, genetic evidence now confirms that they traveled from deep within South America, likely navigating across the sea from the Amazon basin. These weren't primitive wanderers, they were skilled navigators, long before European explorers arrived. But if these early settlers were so advanced, what happened to them? For centuries, history has told us that the indigenous Taino people of the Caribbean were completely wiped out after Columbus arrived, that their language, culture, and genetics were erased. But DNA tells a different story. In a groundbreaking study, scientists sequenced ancient Taino genomes and compared them to modern Caribbean populations. The results were shocking. Millions of people today still carry Taino DNA. The genetic legacy of the Caribbean's first people never disappeared. It simply evolved, hidden beneath layers of history. And yet, the story doesn't end there. With the arrival of Europeans in the late 1400s, a new chapter of genetic mixing began. But here's something unexpected. Scientists have discovered that the European DNA found in Caribbean people today is not identical to modern Spaniards or Portuguese. Instead, it carries the signature of a small founder population. This means that, unlike other regions in Latin America, where waves of European settlers continued arriving for centuries, the Caribbean's European ancestors were fewer in number, and their genes spread quickly. This bottleneck effect created a unique European DNA signature, one distinct from modern Iberian populations. But perhaps the most striking discovery lies in the African ancestry of the Caribbean. Many believe that African ancestry in the region comes from a single wave of migration during the transatlantic slave trade. But DNA analysis reveals something different. There were actually two distinct waves of African migration. The first occurred in the 1500s, with enslaved Africans primarily from Senegal, Gambia, and Ghana. This early group left behind shorter, older DNA tracks. Then, centuries later, during the height of the slave trade in the 1700s, a second wave arrived from Nigeria, Cameroon, and the Congo. These people left behind longer, more recent DNA segments. The genetic imprint of the transatlantic slave trade remains visible, woven into the DNA of millions today. So what does all of this mean? It means that Caribbean people today are living proof of survival, adaptation, and resilience. Their DNA tells a story that history books could never fully capture. A story of ancient seafarers, lost civilizations, colonial upheaval, and forced migration. And for those who take a DNA test and discover unexpected ancestry, it's not just a random mix of percentages on a chart. It's a connection to a past far richer and more complex than they ever imagined. For centuries, the Caribbean was seen as a place where cultures collided. European colonizers, African slaves, and indigenous people who were supposedly wiped out. But what if the real story is far more complex? What if the DNA of modern Caribbean people holds secrets that history books never told us? The genetic legacy of the Caribbean isn't just about survival. It's a direct link to lost civilizations, hidden migrations, and unexpected ancestry that challenges everything we thought we knew. One of the most shocking discoveries in recent years is the true origin of the Caribbean's indigenous people. For decades, many believed they came from North America, gradually moving southward. But DNA evidence now paints a different picture. The first people of the Caribbean actually came from deep within South America, bringing with them the traditions, languages, and genes of ancient Amazonian civilizations. This migration wasn't a slow drift of small groups. It was a deliberate expansion by seafaring people who mastered ocean navigation thousands of years before Columbus set sail. The Taino, often considered extinct, were the dominant indigenous group in the Caribbean when Europeans arrived. But were they really wiped out? Historical records claim disease, war, and forced labor erased them from existence. Yet, modern DNA studies reveal something remarkable. Taino genes are still present in many Caribbean people today. This means their story didn't end with colonization. It simply changed form, surviving in the very people who were once told they had no connection to their indigenous ancestors. But the indigenous story is only one part of the genetic puzzle. The European ancestry in Caribbean DNA also carries an unexpected twist. Unlike in other parts of Latin America, where European settlers continued arriving for centuries, the Caribbean experienced something different. Genetic analysis reveals that most of the European DNA found in Caribbean people today comes from a small and early group of settlers rather than continuous migration. This created what scientists call a founder effect, where the DNA of a few individuals spread rapidly through the population, making modern Caribbean European ancestry distinct from that of present-day Spain or Portugal. Then comes the African connection, a chapter often discussed, but rarely understood in its full complexity. DNA evidence now confirms that there were not one, but two major waves of African migration to the Caribbean. The first group, arriving in the 1500s, came primarily from Senegal, Gambia, and Ghana. They were among the first Africans forcibly brought to the region, and their DNA today is found in shorter, older genetic segments. The second wave, arriving much later in the 18th century, came from Nigeria, Cameroon, and the Congo, leaving behind longer, more recent DNA segments. These genetic differences prove what historical records suggested but couldn't fully explain. Different African regions contributed to Caribbean ancestry at different times, shaping the genetic landscape in ways still visible today. And it's not just about history. This knowledge has real-world implications. The genetic diversity within the Caribbean means that people from different islands, or even different families, might have completely different health risks, medical responses, and ancestral connections. Understanding these genetic patterns isn't just about knowing where we came from. It's about using this information to build a healthier future, where medicine can be personalized for people whose histories were once erased or misunderstood. The Caribbean is more than a cultural melting pot. It's a genetic masterpiece. Every DNA test, every new study, and every person who traces their roots adds another piece to this fascinating puzzle. The past isn't gone. It's living, breathing, and still evolving in the people of the Caribbean today. For centuries, history painted a simple picture of the Caribbean's past, one where the indigenous people vanished, European settlers took over, and African slaves became the foundation of modern populations. But DNA is now proving that history is far more complex, with genetic footprints revealing a hidden past that reshapes everything we thought we knew. The genes of modern Caribbean people tell a story of survival, adaptation, and deep connections to ancient civilizations that thrived long before Columbus ever set foot in the Americas. One of the most groundbreaking revelations in recent years is the true origin of the Caribbean's first inhabitants. While historians once believed they came from North America, new genetic evidence tells a different story. The earliest settlers of the Caribbean islands weren't from the north at all. They came from deep within South America, particularly the Amazon and Orinoco River basins. These weren't isolated, primitive groups, but highly skilled seafarers who traveled hundreds of miles across open ocean, bringing with them agriculture, language, and culture. Their DNA, remarkably, still exists in modern Caribbean people, linking them to indigenous communities thousands of miles away. And then there's the Taino, the people Christopher Columbus encountered in 1492. For centuries, history books told us they were wiped out, victims of European disease and colonization. But modern genetics tells a completely different story. DNA studies reveal that TainoAncestry is still alive in the people of the Caribbean today. This means their culture didn't vanish. It adapted, blending with African and European influences, surviving in family traditions, language, and even certain genetic traits unique to Caribbean populations. But the genetic story of the Caribbean isn't just about the past. It's about what happened next. The arrival of Europeans brought new genetic influences, but unlike in other parts of the Americas, where settlers kept arriving for centuries, the Caribbean experienced something different. Genetic evidence shows that most of the European DNA in modern Caribbean people comes from a small, early group of settlers, meaning that instead of continuous migration, a few thousand colonists shaped the genetic makeup of millions. This created a founder effect, where certain European traits became far more common in the Caribbean than they are in modern Spain or Portugal. The African influence in Caribbean DNA is another layer of this incredible story. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly brought millions of Africans to the region, but genetic evidence now confirms something history could only speculate. There were two major waves of African migration, separated by centuries. The first wave, arriving in the 1500s, came mainly from Senegal, Gambia, and Ghana, and their genetic imprint is found in shorter, older segments of DNA. The second wave, in the 18th century, brought Africans from Nigeria, Cameroon, and the Congo, whose DNA appears in much longer, more recent segments. These genetic differences reveal that African ancestry in the Caribbean isn't a single story. It's a layered history, shaped by time and migration patterns that varied across the islands. Even today, this genetic diversity impacts Caribbean people in ways they might not realize. Health conditions, responses to medicine, and even inherited traits are all tied to this rich genetic mixture. Scientists are only beginning to understand how these genetic patterns affect everything from disease risk to physical traits, proving that ancestry isn't just a window into the past. It's a key to the future of medicine and identity. The Caribbean isn't just a place of cultural fusion. It's a living genetic archive, holding the secrets of lost civilizations, untold migrations, and survival against all odds. DNA is rewriting the history of the Caribbean, proving that its past is more diverse, resilient, and interconnected than we ever imagined. For centuries, the Caribbean's history has been told through colonization, migration, and trade. But the real story isn't just in history books. It's written in the DNA of the people who live there today. Every strand of Caribbean DNA is a living record, carrying secrets of survival, migration, and unexpected ancestry. Scientists are now uncovering genetic clues that reveal a deeper, more complex story than anyone ever imagined. One of the most surprising discoveries is the survival of Taino ancestry. For years, history taught that the indigenous Taino people, the first to greet Columbus, were wiped out. But DNA tells a different story. The genetic signatures of the Taino are still present in modern Caribbean populations, particularly in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. This means that instead of vanishing, their bloodline quietly endured, passed down through generations despite colonization, disease, and forced assimilation. Today, their DNA is a silent testament to resilience, proving that their legacy is far from lost. But the Caribbean's genetic history didn't start with European contact. The first people to settle the islands didn't come from North America, as once believed, but from South America. DNA shows that the earliest Caribbean settlers were connected to indigenous groups from the Amazon and Orinoco basins. Thousands of years before Columbus, these early navigators were crossing the sea, bringing with them agriculture, languages, and traditions that shaped the region. Their genetic imprint remained strongest in isolated areas, revealing an ancestry that predates written history. Then came the Europeans, but here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Unlike mainland Latin America, where European ancestry was introduced continuously over centuries, the Caribbean's European genetic influence mostly comes from a single, early wave of settlers. This means that modern Caribbean populations don't just have generic Spanish or Portuguese ancestry. They carry DNA from a very specific group of early colonists whose genetic traits became dominant over time. Some traits common in Caribbean populations today are actually rare in modern Spain or Portugal, because they were inherited from a small group of early European settlers, not from later waves of migration. The African ancestry of the Caribbean is just as complex. The transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the region, but genetic evidence shows something history books never fully documented. There were two separate waves of African migration, each leaving a distinct genetic impact. The first wave, starting in the early 1500s, brought people mainly from Senegal, Gambia, and Ghana. Their genetic markers today appear in shorter, fragmented DNA segments, a sign of deeper ancestry. The second wave, during the peak of the late 1700s, brought enslaved Africans from Nigeria, Cameroon, and the Congo, leaving longer, more intact DNA sequences in today's Caribbean populations. This discovery proves that African heritage in the Caribbean didn't come from a single source, but from multiple migrations over time, each adding new layers to the genetic story. But this is more than just history. Caribbean DNA is shaping modern science. The mix of indigenous, African, and European ancestry affects everything from disease risk to medication response. Researchers are now identifying genetic traits unique to Caribbean populations, helping to develop personalized medicine that could improve treatments and save lives. Understanding these genetic patterns isn't just about the past. It's about building a healthier future. Caribbean DNA is a genetic time machine, preserving the history of migration, survival, and adaptation. With every new discovery, science is rewriting what we know about the region and its people. History may have tried to erase some voices, but DNA ensures their stories are still being told. For centuries, the Caribbean was thought to be an isolated world, a collection of islands shaped only by the people who lived there. But genetic science is proving that the Caribbean has always been connected, linked by migrations, trade, and cultural exchange long before Europeans arrived. Modern DNA research is revealing stunning connections between Caribbean people and populations across South America, Africa, Europe, and even distant Pacific islands, proving that Caribbean ancestry is more complex than history books ever imagined. One of the most striking discoveries is the deep link between indigenous Caribbean populations and the Amazonian tribes of South America. Ancient DNA from a 1,000-year-old Taino woman, found in the Bahamas, shows a direct genetic connection to modern-day Arawakan-speaking groups living in the Orinoco Basin and the Amazon rainforest. This means that the ancestors of the Caribbean's first inhabitants didn't come from North America, as once believed, but traveled up from the depths of the South American interior, navigating rivers and oceans to settle the islands. Their genetic signature still exists today in the DNA of modern Caribbean people, hidden within their ancestry for generations. But the genetic connections don't stop there. The arrival of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean during the transatlantic slave trade left an undeniable mark, not just culturally, but genetically. What's surprising is that different Caribbean islands have distinct African genetic influences. Haitians and Jamaicans have ancestry tracing largely to the Congo and Nigeria, while Cubans and Puerto Ricans have more genetic ties to Ghana and Senegal. These differences mirror the historical records of where enslaved Africans were taken from, providing a genetic map of the forced migrations that shaped the region. Europe also left a lasting genetic impact on the Caribbean, but not in the way most people assume. Rather than continuous migration over centuries, DNA evidence shows that a small group of European settlers contributed the vast majority of European ancestry found in Caribbean populations today. This means that many modern Caribbean people are more genetically similar to a handful of early Iberian colonizers than to present-day Spaniards or Portuguese. Over generations, these genes were passed down, shaped by isolation and genetic drift, creating a unique European-Caribbean genetic signature that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Perhaps the most unexpected discovery in Caribbean DNA is the trace of genetic links to Pacific island populations. Some studies have found a small but distinct ancestral component in Caribbean genomes that resembles DNA from Melanesia and the indigenous peoples of Australia. While the exact origins of this connection remain a mystery, one theory suggests that ancient migrations, possibly from early seafaring cultures, could have introduced these genetic markers thousands of years ago. This hidden ancestry hints at ancient global connections that historians are only beginning to understand. These genetic findings are not just rewriting the history of Caribbean ancestry, they're also changing the future. Understanding these deep connections helps scientists trace how genes influence health, disease, and even physical traits in modern Caribbean populations. Some genetic variations linked to diabetes, heart disease, and immune system responses appear at different frequencies in Caribbean people compared to other populations. influencing how they react to certain medications and treatments. This could revolutionize personalized medicine, making healthcare more effective for millions of people with Caribbean heritage worldwide. The Caribbean has always been at the crossroads of human history. Its people are not just descendants of one group or another, but a fusion of ancient migrations, forced movements, and unexpected connections stretching across continents. Every drop of Caribbean DNA is a living record of survival, adaptation, and resilience, carrying the stories of those who came before. The genetic legacy of the Caribbean isn't just about the past. It's a bridge between civilizations, proving that the Caribbean has always been part of a much bigger, interconnected world. For centuries, the dominant narrative of the Caribbean's history has revolved around colonization, the transatlantic slave trade, and the cultural fusion that followed. But new DNA research is proving that Caribbean ancestry is far older, deeper, and more resilient than history books have acknowledged. Hidden within the genetic code of modern Caribbean people is a story of endurance, survival, and unexpected continuity. A story that challenges the idea that native Caribbean populations simply vanished after European contact. For generations, it was believed that the Taino and other indigenous Caribbean groups were completely wiped out, destroyed by disease, warfare, and enslavement. Historical records describe the catastrophic decline of native populations within a few decades of European arrival. But genetic evidence tells a very different story. Scientists analyzing modern Caribbean genomes have discovered that Taino DNA is still present in the people of the Caribbean today. This means that rather than disappearing, indigenous Caribbean ancestry has survived and been passed down through generations, hidden beneath layers of European and African influence. One of the most striking discoveries comes from Puerto Rico, where up to 15% of the average genome still carries Native American ancestry. This native component is also present in populations from Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and even parts of South America, proving that the legacy of the Taino lives on, not just in cultural traditions, but in the very DNA of modern Caribbean people. Some families, particularly in rural areas, have higher than average levels of indigenous ancestry, suggesting that certain communities preserved their genetic heritage more strongly than others. But this discovery raises a crucial question. If Taino DNA survived, what does that mean for their descendants? For many Caribbean people, this is a powerful moment of reconnection, a realization that the stories of their ancestors weren't erased, but instead live on within them. The recognition of Taino genetic heritage is reshaping cultural identity, as more people reclaim their indigenous roots, traditions, and histories that were once thought to be lost. The impact of this genetic legacy goes beyond identity. It also has medical and scientific implications. Indigenous Caribbean ancestry is linked to specific genetic traits, immune system adaptations, and even disease susceptibilities. Certain genes inherited from native ancestors may influence how modern Caribbean populations respond to diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and even viral infections. Understanding these genetic factors could revolutionize medicine, leading to treatments that are specifically tailored to Caribbean populations based on their unique genetic history. Ultimately, the discovery of Taino DNA in modern Caribbean people is more than just a scientific breakthrough. It's a challenge to the way history has been told. The Caribbean is not just a story of conquest and destruction, but one of survival and resilience. The ancestors of today's Caribbean people were never truly erased. They endured, adapted, and left their mark in ways no history book ever imagined. Their legacy is written in the bloodlines of millions, a testament to the fact that no people truly disappear as long as their descendants carry their story forward.